This is another Read Me Something reward for Reich E. Spore's Patreon. We are reading from my Oz-based novel, Polychrome, Chapter 31. What are we? Shh! I gave a quick gesture. She was speaking too loudly for this area. The high, steep walls of the valley, almost a canyon, with its nearly bare, scrubby walls and tumbled rock would channel sound all too well. Zenga's mouth tightened, and for a minute I thought she might continue speaking. Despite her apparent easy acceptance of my embarrassing predicament, things hadn't been entirely comfortable between us since I'd turned her down. But she gave a barely audible sigh and tried again, very quietly this time. What are we doing here? You mean as compared with other possible locations? She nodded. This area is right near the border of the Gnome Kingdom, Gilgad, and the Land of Eve. The Wheelers and a couple of other groups squabble over control of the part of the area, even though it's really part of the Kingdom of Eve. The Wheelers and their allies make ocean shipping possible, but a nuisance, so most of the commerce between Gilgad and Eve comes along the border of the Gnome Kingdom, but doesn't actually cross over because the gnomes have a notorious dislike for uninvited intruders. I gestured at the high rock walls surrounding us. This particular valley happens to be one of three which end up funneling a large portion of trade directly through them. And this one is nearest to the Gnome Kingdom and so avoided as much as possible. But it's also the most direct and thus used by people in a hurry. Zenga nodded her understanding, and her reply was almost too loud, but she quieted herself without reminder. Ah, and so the most desperate, or those with the most valuable cargoes, are the ones to use this route, and thus are exactly the targets that certain forces are going after. And you think I'm sure? Okay, that was a bit of an exaggeration, but I had a good feeling that if I was going to find what I was looking for, it would be here. He would be here. We waited quietly, patiently. With Zenga's help and the memory of Nimbus' training, and some of what I could dredge up from camping with my father, was it over 30 years ago? We'd put up an entirely mundane shelter and blind, concealing us from sight and sense in a manner that I hoped to be under the radar, so to speak, for beings that played in a more mystical realm. Zenga, being mostly mortal and physically close by, should minimize the chance of her being sensed. Time passed. I knew this was a waiting game. Even if I was right, our passage would have been noted, though the details of that passage would hopefully not. Good guys and bad guys both would be waiting to make sure no one else was around. The waiting was not easy on either of us, I suspect. It certainly wasn't easy on me, being that close to Zenga and, ironically, far more aware of her presence now than I'd allowed myself to be before. And, yes, that one part of me was regularly kicking me for being a blind romantic idiot. But what I told her was still true. Psst, Lord Eric. Her eyes were sharper than mine. No surprise that, given age differences, even with Iris Mirabilis' thoughtful rejuvenation of my inborn lenses. A tiny movement was visible at the northwest end of the valley, the Eve end. Looks like a small caravan, 10 wagons maybe. She nodded. So we wait a bit longer? See how things go? Yes. The little group of wagons trundled slowly closer, moving along a narrow trail that was well defined by the passage of countless prior travelers. I could see outriders in the front and on either side, watching, scanning. So far they had seen no sign of opposition, but their movements showed that they were nervous. Quick movements, a little too quick and jerky. Even the best eyes would not have helped them in this situation. We'd been here for days, but even we were taken completely unawares when innocuous boulders suddenly flickered and transformed into 24 bowmen, with another dozen men carefully spaced around the perimeter, 3 on either side, front and back, who, with very nasty grins, pulled out the logs that held back carefully engineered artificial landslides. Even the outriders had been taken utterly by surprise. The front and rear went down under the masses of granite, and the others froze, realizing they were in a perfect crossfire. "What?" Zenga whispered. "Not any of the Temblors or Tempests?" I shook my head, watching. For the most part, Oz has kept its word not to interfere. I ran into a sort of independent operation, I think. No, this is more homegrown banditry, but bolder, knowing there's no power around that can afford the effort to wipe them out. "A shame about those two," a cheerful voice called out. We could now see, stepping into view atop the front roadblock, a flamboyantly dressed man in a red and gold cloak, a slender circlet of gold in his black hair. "Doing their jobs a bit too well, or not well enough. That's the problem, you see, over-eager and under-trained. Unlike my men, I think you'll agree." The man in the lead wagon stood slowly. "Very well, you've caught us, and killed 2 good men while you were at it. I'd prefer to avoid bloodshed." The cheerful man's laugh was somehow sinister. "I'm sure you would. I'm sure you would. So you'll be turning over your cargo to me, then?" "I don't see how I could prevent you. We could fight and perhaps kill some of you, but—" He gave an expansive, futile gesture. "A man of reason. How excellent. Then you and your people will move away from the wagons, leaving your weapons, of course, and any valuables." The leader of the caravan waved downward to the others. The outriders began to move in, tossing their spears and bows to the ground, but one rode near the leader, who stiffened and turned. "Pardon me, sir, but might we know your name?" "How courteous of you. Though a shame you needed a reminder and courtesy from your own outriders." The crowned man gave a deep, elaborate bow. "I am known simply as the King of the Road, and these are my kindly highwaymen." Oh, crap. There were, of course, a lot of brigands working these routes, but even in that group of bastards, this one stood out. The few who'd survived meeting him and gotten to Gilgad had described scenes of slaughter and depravity as terrible as any I'd heard from the mortal world, which made this guy even worse from a fairy perspective. Something like him couldn't have existed years ago, and I had a grim suspicion as to why he could now. "We have to help them," Zenga hissed. I hated to give up our concealment, but if, as it appeared, the leader of the caravan was about to change his mind, he'd need as much help as he could get, now that over half his people were already disarmed. "Enough!" The new voice was deep, sending rumbling echoes, chasing themselves around the valley and yanking everyone's attention upward, gazing at a point in the valley directly across from where Zenga and I sat in our blind. A single figure stood atop a tall spire of stone, gray cloak streaming out in the wind, a polished staff of stone gripped in one hand, head concealed within a deep cowl. "These people are under my protection now, O King. Stand aside and let them pass." The King of the Road shook his head in an exaggerated double take, shading his eyes and gazing about in a dramatic pantomime of disbelief. "Truly, your men conceal themselves marvelously, for even now I cannot descry their positions. Yet surely you must have many men indeed to contest my rulership of the road, for only a madman would dare do so alone." Then it was his turn to stiffen momentarily, and he continued, "Only a madman, or the penitent." The gray-cloaked figure gave an ironic bow. All humor and civilized veneer vanished in that instant. "Kill him! Kill him now!" Now I held Zenga back. I had to see. I had to be sure. The penitent vanished from the stone, and the instant the king shouted, vanished as though he had never been there, as a storm of arrows screamed through the space his figure had occupied. The caravan took advantage of this distraction, grabbing up their weapons. The grey-cloaked form materialized, there was no other word for it, from the dusty greyness of the ground, near to one of the archers, and struck with his staff, shattering the bowman's weapon and then laying him flat on the ground. He leapt and rolled aside as though the cloak enclosed not a man but a ball, tumbling nimbly down the slope with an erratic, almost impossible to follow motion that confounded the efforts of the other highwaymen to strike with bow or catch with desperate sprints. The king of the road flung out his hand, muttering something too faint to catch, but I could see a poisonously green powder fly forward. Virulent emerald leaves sprouted from the dusty ground, transforming into spiky vines that reached and grasped, slowing the penitent, pulling at his cloak. The same vines avoided the king as he leapt down among them, drawing a black serrated sword and striding with a cold, cruel grin towards the penitent, who brought up his stone staff and prepared to meet the bandit leader, despite the still growing thicket of vicious vines. "That is our cue," I said. We burst from our concealment and charged down on two highwaymen who'd engaged one of the outriders. One barely had time to curse before Zenga's double-bladed cut took off his head. The others raised the alarm, and the King of the Road's eyes narrowed as he took in my glittering crystal armor and Zenga's terrible dancing blades. "More uninvited guests. What a bothersome day. But at least it shall end with a considerable nuisance dispatched." The penitent was not cooperative, however. Though the vines hampered his every move, still he managed to parry the strokes of the black blade. He was unable to strike back, though, and it seemed clear that eventually the king would find an opening. We were in better condition, however, as the combination of the penitent's distraction and our sudden appearance had allowed the caravan to start fighting back in earnest. The attackers were no longer in an overwhelmingly powerful position. If the archers on our side turned to focus on the caravan, they were open to our assault, and if they focused on us, the caravan's archers could target them. Most of the caravan's people were now on our side of the wagons, making the other archers essentially useless. They'd have to come down and engage hand to hand. One of the bigger bruisers came at me. I ducked aside, took a blow in the armor that stung, and did a leaping kick that took him right in the temple. I winced inwardly as I felt the impact, and though I knew this guy must have done things that would earn him the death penalty, I still hoped I hadn't killed him. But that left me an open path towards the still widening sea of twining greenery. "Zenga, keep it up!" I called and sprinted downward. "Lord Herrick, look out, you'll—" She was forced to stop her warnings as two more of the king's highwaymen engaged her. But I focused my will and strode forward. As they reached towards me, the vines abruptly stiffened, then fell limp, shriveling at the merest touch. A massive, thorn-covered tentacle lashed out. I slapped it aside hard, and it broke and shattered like an ancient dried-up branch. The king whirled in disbelief, seeing me coming through his deadly tangle as though walking through a harmless garden. What? The stone staff lashed out and cracked with bone-breaking force on the brigand's left arm. The king restrained a shriek of agony and struck back, forcing the penitent back on the defensive, then leaping away, sheathing a sword. With his good hand, he pulled forth a black sphere, an oversized marble that seemed to have a faint red glow at its heart, and drew back his arm. "I do not know who you are," he said, in a pain-racked voice far different from his prior false urbanity, "but perhaps I will learn from your corpse." The sphere bulleted forward, and instinctively I put up my hand. It smacked solidly into my palm, and my fingers curled around it as though catching a tennis ball. I held it up and studied the now graying sphere, the light within fading away. "Oh, I don't think so." The expression of disbelief on the king's face was almost comical. I smiled back. "Here, catch." I pitched the sphere back at him. Reflexively he raised his own hand, realizing too late that it had become the same red-tinged black as soon as it left my hand. On contact, the glassy sphere detonated in a flare of searing red flame and dead black smoke. That was more than enough for the highwaymen. Seeing nothing but a greasy column of fire where their leader had been, they broke and ran. The singing bows of the caravan made sure that few of them completed their escape. On the self-proclaimed king's death, the vines too had died. The penitent emerged from the collapsing thicket and nodded. "My thanks to you, stranger. And strange indeed you are. Still, it was good fortune you passed by." "No fortune. as I suspect you already guess," I answered, seeing Zenga coming down towards us. "I was in search of you, and knew from the stories that this was the sort of place you must be found." Up close it was clear that the penitent was very short, little more than half my height, though his movements and actions had shown great strength and considerable length of arm. The caravan's people were now tending to each other. They would surely come to us shortly, but for now we were alone. The penitent glanced in their direction and then back to me, face still concealed within his cloak's hood. "And for what purpose do you seek me, stranger?" "I need you to guide me where no other can lead, penitent. I need you to show me the way to the Gnome King's door. Give me entry to his kingdom." He gave a laugh, one I thought might be tinged with bitterness. "He welcomes few to his lands at all, stranger, and even fewer who seek his door uninvited. What makes you believe I could even do as you ask?" "I believe so because I know who you are, penitent, and why you bear that name and do these deeds. Because you were once much as those who rule Oz now are, and you have come to regret that." He had frozen and stood still now, still as stone. "Because you were driven from that kingdom, and now walk its borders, alone, homeless, friendless save for those you protect, yet never one of them, because you seek to make up for sins they cannot know." Zenga's eyes widened as she realized what I was saying. "Because you are Ruggedo, once Roquat the Red, who once was king of the gnomes."